Somewhere in occupied Europe, an American OSS officer is crouched in a farmhouse basement, watching a British agent field strip a weapon he has never seen before. It looks nothing like a pistol. It looks like a piece of plumbing pipe with a rubber handle. The British agent loads it, presses it against a sandbag, and fires. There is no bang, no crack, just a soft, almost embarrassed cough, quieter than a book falling off a shelf. The American stares at the weapon for a long moment, then says the same thing dozens of his countrymen would say over the next 2 years. I need one of those. That weapon was the Welrod, and by the time World War II ended, it had become the single most coveted piece of hardware among American Special Operations personnel who had the rare privilege of encountering it. Not because it was powerful, not because it was accurate, not because it looked impressive on a soldier's hip. It was coveted because it did something no American weapon of the era could do. It killed in complete silence. This is the story of a gun so quiet that men who used it described it not as a weapon, but as a rumor with a trigger. To understand why the Welrod became legendary, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. And that problem began not with the Americans, but with the British, in the darkest years of the war. In 1941, Winston Churchill gave an order to the newly formed Special Operations Executive that has since become one of the most quoted lines of the entire conflict: set Europe ablaze. The SOE's mission was to organize, arm, and direct resistance movements across every occupied country on the continent, from the fjords of Norway to the hills of Greece. Agents were parachuted behind enemy lines. Radios were smuggled in false-bottom suitcases. Explosives were hidden in loaves of bread. But there was a gap in the arsenal that no amount of ingenuity could close with existing technology. Resistance fighters and covert agents regularly needed to eliminate specific individuals: a Gestapo informant who had betrayed a network, a collaborator feeding intelligence to the occupiers, a German officer overseeing deportations. These killings had to happen in city streets, in apartment buildings, sometimes in rooms full of witnesses, and the killer had to walk away without triggering an immediate manhunt. A gunshot in an occupied city was a death sentence for everyone nearby. Checkpoints would go up within minutes. Buildings would be searched. Reprisals against civilians were common and brutal. The weapons available at the time were simply not built for this kind of war. Knives required the killer to get within arm's reach, and close-quarters killing left evidence, noise, and enormous personal risk. Standard suppressed weapons of the period, including the modified Sten gun, reduced report to around 130 decibels, which is roughly the sound of a jackhammer. That might disguise the distinctive rhythm of automatic fire in the middle of a firefight, but it did nothing to hide a single assassination in a quiet street. What the resistance needed, and what British intelligence needed to give them, was a firearm that could produce a sound so faint it could be mistaken for anything else. A car door, a dropped book, a cough. Before any of that could happen, though, the men designing Britain's covert arsenal had to reckon with just how badly existing solutions had failed. Garrotes and knives, the traditional tools of silent killing, demanded the operative close to point-blank range and hold that position through the entire act, an enormous personal risk in a city crawling with patrols. Poison was unreliable, slow to act, and difficult to administer with any certainty. Improvised silencers built by field workshops tended to fail after a handful of shots, the rubber wipes inside degrading, or the baffles cracking under repeated firing. None of these were solutions. They were compromises, and compromises got agents killed. The task landed on the desks of a small, secretive team at Station 9 of the Inter-Services Research Bureau, based in Welwyn Garden City, north of London. This was Britain's dedicated facility for special-purpose weapons and sabotage equipment, and the men working there approached firearms less like traditional gunsmiths and more like acoustic engineers solving a physics problem. A gunshot produces sound from 3 separate sources, and to build something genuinely silent, all 3 had to be addressed. The first is the explosive release of propellant gas as it escapes the muzzle. The second is the sonic boom created when a bullet exceeds the speed of sound. The third is the mechanical noise of the weapon's action cycling, ejecting a spent case and loading a new round. The team started with the bullet itself. Standard 9mm parabellum ammunition travels at roughly 350 meters per second, comfortably faster than the speed of sound, which sits at approximately 343 meters per second at sea level. No matter how effective the suppressor, a supersonic round would always announce itself with a sharp crack as it broke the sound barrier. The fix was to load subsonic 9mm ammunition, reducing the propellant charge so the round left the barrel at around 290 meters per second, safely under the threshold. Next came mechanical noise. Semi-automatic pistols generate a surprising amount of sound simply from their slide cycling back and forth, ejecting a case and stripping a new round from the magazine. The designers eliminated this problem entirely by abandoning the semi-automatic action altogether. The weapon they built used a manually operated bolt, worked by hand between shots. Slow, yes, but nearly silent. The final and most difficult challenge was the muzzle blast itself, the expanding cloud of propellant gas that produces the sharp bang most people associate with gunfire. The solution here was the most radical design decision of all. Rather than screwing a separate suppressor onto the end of a barrel, the entire weapon was built around the suppressor. Roughly 2/3 of the gun's total length was dedicated to an internal series of baffles and expansion chambers, through which the propellant gas traveled, cooling and slowing in stages before finally escaping into the air at a fraction of its original pressure. A standard 9mm pistol fired without suppression produces around 160 decibels at the muzzle, loud enough to cause instant hearing damage. This new weapon produced approximately 73 decibels. That is quieter than an idling car, closer to the sound of a hand clap heard from across a room. From 10 meters away, it disappeared almost entirely into ordinary street noise. They called it the Welrod. The finished weapon measured just over 14 inches from end to end. It had a rubber-wrapped cylindrical grip concealing a magazine that held 6 rounds in early versions and 8 in later ones. There was no visible trigger guard, no polished finish, no attempt to look like a conventional firearm at all. The barrel section, which doubled as the suppressor housing, simply protruded from the front like a length of pipe. Sights were minimal, a fixed blade at the front and a simple notch at the rear, because precision was never the point. Effective range topped out around 23 meters, and in practice, most kills happened at a fraction of that distance, often with the muzzle pressed directly against the target. This was not a battlefield weapon, it was a scalpel. Production began quietly in late 1942, and it remained one of the most tightly guarded programs of the entire war. Even today, historians disagree on exact production numbers, with estimates ranging anywhere from roughly 2,800 to as many as 14,000 units manufactured before the war's end. Serial numbers were deliberately scattered and records deliberately incomplete, a level of operational secrecy that speaks to just how sensitive this program was considered at the highest levels of British intelligence. The rubber baffles inside the suppressor stack were themselves a small engineering achievement, cut slightly undersized, so each bullet had to force its way through, forming a temporary gas seal at every stage before relaxing back into shape after the round had passed. This was also the weapon's known weakness. Each wipe degraded a little more with every shot fired, and after roughly a few dozen rounds, the suppression effect began to noticeably diminish. Field manuals of the period instructed agents to treat the Welrod almost as a single-use tool for any one operation, conserving shots and replacing worn components whenever supply allowed. It was not a weapon built for sustained engagement. It was built to be perfect for the first shot, when perfection mattered most. 2 versions eventually entered production, one chambered in 9mm parabellum for use against personnel, and a rarer, 32 ACP variant intended for slightly different operational needs. Both shared the same core philosophy: Strip away everything a conventional pistol needed for speed and volume of fire, and replace it entirely with silence. Training on the weapon emphasized patience above all else. An agent was taught to get as close as physically possible, ideally pressing the muzzle directly against the target's body, and to accept the slow bolt-action cycle as the price of near-total silence, rather than fight against it. By early 1943, Welrods were reaching resistance networks across occupied Europe through clandestine supply drops, and it did not take long for word of this weapon to travel far beyond the circles that had commissioned it. American involvement in irregular warfare during World War II ran through the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the wartime precursor to the CIA. OSS operatives worked closely with British SOE agents throughout the European theater, often training alongside them, sharing safe houses, and in several documented instances, sharing equipment. It was through this close cooperation that American operatives first encountered the Welrod, and the reaction was consistent almost everywhere it happened. Astonishment, followed immediately by a desire to have one for themselves. Part of this had to do with what the Americans had been issued instead. The OSS had developed its own suppressed sidearm, a modified high-standard pistol chambered in .22 caliber known as the HDM, or High Standard Model D. It was a genuinely quiet weapon, achieving around 90 decibels, which made it useful for eliminating sentries or guard dogs during sabotage missions. But the small .22 round came with a serious limitation. It frequently failed to incapacitate a target with a single shot, especially through heavy winter clothing, and OSS training manuals of the period specifically instructed operatives to fire multiple rounds to the head to ensure a kill. Compare that to the Welrod's 9mm chambering, which, even at reduced velocity, delivered dramatically more stopping power in a single, quiet shot. For American agents, who had trained with the HDM and understood its limitations intimately, seeing the Welrod in action was like watching a colleague's tool solve a problem theirs never quite could. There is a particular kind of respect that develops between professionals who understand exactly how hard a problem is, and American operatives who worked alongside the British in France, Norway, and the Low Countries developed exactly that respect for the Welrod. Some accounts from OSS veterans describe requesting Welrods directly from British counterparts for specific missions where the OSS's own equipment fell short. British supply, understandably protective of a program shrouded in this much secrecy, did not hand these weapons out freely, but limited numbers did make their way into American hands through joint operations, particularly in the lead-up to and following the Normandy invasion, when American and British Special Operations personnel were working in unprecedented proximity behind enemy lines. This cooperation ran through the Jedburgh teams, small three-man units combining British, American, and French operatives who parachuted into occupied France to coordinate resistance activity ahead of the invasion. These mixed teams, trained together, planned together, and in the field, shared equipment out of sheer practical necessity. It was exactly the kind of environment where an American operative might find himself handed a Welrod for a specific mission, use it once, and spend the rest of his career telling other soldiers about the gun that made almost no sound at all. Word of mouth among a tight, secretive community of operators is a powerful thing, and within OSS circles, the Welrod's reputation grew largely through exactly this kind of first-hand account, passed from one operative to another, since the weapon itself remained too scarce and too tightly controlled for widespread American issue. If you're enjoying this so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. Now let's look at exactly how the Welrod stacked up against what else was on the table during the war, because the comparison is where its legend really comes into focus. German suppressed weapons of the period were largely adaptations of standard service pistols rather than purpose-built silent killing tools. The Walther PPK, for instance, could be fitted with a screw-on suppressor that brought its report down to roughly 115 decibels. Quieter than an unsuppressed pistol, certainly, but still unmistakably a gunshot to anyone within earshot. German suppressor development in general was oriented toward reducing a sniper's signature at distance, not enabling silent assassination in a crowded room. It solved a different problem entirely. The American HDM, as already discussed, achieved approximately 90 decibels, genuinely impressive for the era, but hamstrung by the anemic stopping power of its .22 caliber round. Multiple shots were often necessary, which meant more time exposed, more risk, and more chances for something to go wrong. Set against both of these, the Welrod's 73 decibels, paired with a 9mm round, occupied a category almost entirely its own. It was quieter than the German suppressed pistols by a wide margin, and it hit dramatically harder than the American HDM. No other firearm fielded by any major power during the Second World War managed to combine that level of acoustic suppression with that level of terminal effectiveness. This is the technical reality behind why American operatives who encountered it wanted one so badly. It was not sentiment. It was that the Welrod was simply, verifiably, the best tool available for a very specific and very dangerous job. The weapon's battlefield record only reinforced its reputation. In France, Maquis resistance fighters used Welrods for what they grimly termed executive actions, quietly eliminating collaborators and informants who had betrayed resistance cells to the Gestapo. One account describes a target being eliminated inside a crowded Paris café, the killer rising and walking out through a room full of patrons, none of whom realized anything had happened until the body was discovered slumped at the table. In Denmark, resistance groups used the Welrod extensively against Danish collaborators and German intelligence officers, its silence allowing operations to be conducted in broad daylight in circumstances that would have been suicidal with any louder weapon. In Norway, SOE agents used it during sabotage missions to eliminate sentries without alerting nearby patrols, buying the precious seconds needed to complete a demolition and disappear before an alarm could be raised. In the Netherlands and Belgium, resistance networks used the weapon in similarly dense urban environments, where a single loud gunshot could compromise an entire safehouse network built up over months. The Welrod's silence meant an operation could continue moving immediately after a killing, rather than scattering in response to alarm bells and search parties, a difference that repeatedly meant the gap between a successful mission and a network rolled up by the Gestapo within days. American operatives who fought alongside these resistance networks, whether as Jedburgh team members or OSS liaisons embedded with local cells, witnessed this operational advantage firsthand. They watched resistance fighters walk calmly away from a killing that, with any conventional firearm, would have triggered an immediate cordon of the surrounding blocks. For soldiers trained in a very different, much louder style of warfare, it was a revelation in what a weapon could actually accomplish beyond simply killing a target. For the Germans occupying these territories, the psychological effect was corrosive in a way that conventional resistance attacks never achieved. A firefight was frightening but comprehensible. A silent death in an empty room was something else entirely. Officers began to understand that silence itself offered no protection. Potential informants grew harder to recruit once it became clear that betrayal might be answered not with a warning, not with an arrest, but with a sound so faint it barely registered, followed by nothing at all. By the war's final year, the Welrod had developed a reputation that extended well beyond the small circle of agents actually issued the weapon. It had become something closer to a legend passed between operatives, a story swapped between American and British special operations personnel about the gun that could kill a man in a room full of witnesses and leave everyone else still wondering what that sound had been. For American soldiers and OSS operatives who never got to carry one themselves, the Welrod became something they had merely heard about from men who had, which in the strange economy of wartime rumor often made it even more desirable. The influence did not end when the war did. In the years that followed, American intelligence and special operations circles continued refining the concept the Welrod had proven, that an integrated, purpose-built suppressor, rather than a bolt-on accessory, produced dramatically better results than anything achievable by simply screwing a can onto an existing pistol. Post-war American suppressed pistol programs drew directly on lessons the OSS had absorbed from watching British operatives use the Welrod in the field. In a very real sense, the weapon that so many American soldiers wanted during the war ended up shaping the weapons American soldiers actually carried in the decades after it. The Welrod itself remained in limited British service for decades beyond 1945, reportedly seeing use as late as the 1990s in various special operations contexts, a remarkable service life for a weapon built in a matter of months to solve one very specific wartime problem. Original examples today are exceptionally rare, tightly controlled, and treated as significant historical artifacts by the collectors and institutions fortunate enough to hold them. Museums that do hold genuine wartime Welrods, including collections tied to Britain's Special Forces history, display them as one of the defining objects of the entire irregular warfare campaign, a physical reminder of just how much thought went into solving a problem most militaries never even considered worth solving. For American military history in particular, the Welrod occupies a strange and fascinating place. It was never an American weapon. It was never issued in American numbers, never manufactured on American soil, never standard equipment for any American unit. And yet its influence on how American special operations thought about suppressed weapons, quiet killing, and the value of acoustic discipline in the field is difficult to overstate. Sometimes the most legendary weapons in a nation's military history are not the ones that nation built, but the ones its soldiers encountered once, never forgot, and spent years afterward trying to explain to people who had never seen anything like it. What makes the Welrod's story remarkable is not that it was the most powerful weapon of the Second World War, or the most widely issued, or the most technically sophisticated by the standards of the era's more famous firearms. It is that a small team of engineers, given an almost impossible specification, built something so effective at its one narrow purpose that professionals from an entirely different army, equipped with their own purpose-built silent weapon, still looked at it and wanted one for themselves. That is not the kind of reputation that gets built by marketing or mass production. It is the kind of reputation that gets built one silent room at a time. If you want more deep dives into the weapons history rarely talks about, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.